London News. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, and good night. An update on the Common Law Court International here in Melbourne. We have good news. We have a new sheriff here in Melbourne as well, another area, and in Townsville, of course, another sheriff, the new sheriff takes his oath of office before a jury of his peers on the 29th, which is Saturday. And then he will become a sheriff in a place. It's actually a shire, which will be really good. We'll have a sheriff in a shire reef. Anyway, we've had a number of cases this year, which the grand juries and court cases and convictions, which we have not yet put up on our website. And I apologize for that because after all, we're volunteers. So I'm going to show you a video, two little clips I found from it. They're about 6-7 years old, but they explain the use, the sheriff itself, why the sheriff exists, and how the sheriff is the law of the land, overrides all other law, which is statute law. And I think most people are aware of that. Have a look at this video. It will explain everything, and it's probably the best way to get the information inside your head. And for once and for all, stop chasing wild ideas, fighting the system. You can't fight the system because it is corrupt. You are, if you like, the system, which is natural law, the law of the land, God's law. So one day at a time, support us to support you and fight back. London News sign off. Thanks, guys. Thanks for subscribing, and share the video so people will learn what it's all about. Bye for now.
So the office of sheriff really has the distinction of being the longest continuously existing non-military law enforcement entity. The history of the office, we can go back at least to the year 890 AD. So we're talking 1100, 1200 years ago. King Alfred was on the throne, and he wrote this document called the Book of Dooms. It sounds like some kind of modern day video game or something, but really it was about crimes and punishments. In other words, if you commit this crime, if this is your offense, then this would be your doom, this would be your punishment that would go along with it. And in this Book of Dooms, he references a particular official, a particular official known as a reeve, R-E-E-V-E, kind of loosely translated as a guardian. And the reeve was the king's representative into a particular local area, a particular geographical jurisdiction. And the reeve was responsible for maintaining law and order and peace and safety within the community. They also did things like tax collection, mediated disputes, and they had the authority to call out something called the posse comitatus, which I'll talk about here in more detail in just a moment. And so these reeves were assigned to a geographical jurisdiction known as a shire. And we still have shires over there in England today, don't we? You got Devonshire, Lincolnshire, Worcestershire, if you need some steak sauce. And so the reeve was the king's representative assigned into a shire to do all of those things. So he was known as the reeve of the shire, or, I'm going to get in line with my clicker here to hit the button. Okay, why is it not going now? There it goes. It's the shire reeve. And that's where we get the word sheriff from. So now you know that little bit of trivia. That could be the million-dollar question. You won't even have to call me for a lifeline. Now you'll know that where the term sheriff comes from. The term constable also has an interesting history. The constable was a quartermaster in the king's army, and he was known as a count of the stable. So now you know where that comes from. Fast forward a few hundred years, and we got the Norman Conquest. William of Normandy comes into England. King Harold is on the throne. King Harold is defeated, but William is so impressed by the tenacity, the courage, and the loyalty of the sheriffs that were there under King Harold's rule that he kept that office under his time of rule as well. And then we get, during this time, a list of duties. And it's interesting to me that the duties of the office of sheriff really haven't changed all that much in all these hundreds of years. Back during that era, the sheriff was responsible for representing the king. Now, I always like to say, well, we don't represent the king anymore. We represent somebody much more important than the king, because we represent you, the people, right, as your elected representative. And tax collection, believe it or not, there are sheriffs in certain states that still do this today. Louisiana is one of them, where the sheriff is responsible for collecting taxes. Now, I don't know how you do this, in all honesty. If you spend your time arresting people and collecting taxes, I don't know how you ever get reelected. You would think they would just have a bunch of single-term sheriffs, but they don't over there. Apprehending criminals on most wanted lists, assisting other sheriffs, operating jails. Most jails in America are operated by your local sheriff. Executions, they literally did that too. And not only the kind by you string somebody up from the tree or chop their head off with a guillotine or whatever else they may have done. We also execute orders of the court. We use that term today too. And as sheriffs, we are officers of the court. Again, we don't entertain royalty all that much. But the Magna Carta came out in 1215. Now, the Magna Carta was a really interesting document. For the first time ever in Western history, we have a constitutional document that is limiting the authority of the king. The nobles, and King John signed off on this same, but he was under duress by the nobles. The nobles really interposed themselves, and we're going to come back to that term, between the king and the people. And he said, you know what? The king's authority is not sovereign. The king's authority is not limitless. There are limitations even on the authority of the king. And in the 63 clauses of the Magna Carta, we find that 27 of them specifically refer to the office of sheriff. He was that important of an official under the king's rulership. And the Magna Carta was a document. Our founders looked to this many hundreds of years later in terms of coming up with our founding documents and this whole idea of constitutional limited government. We can trace the history back. I think I'm standing and getting blocked by some of the equipment here. So nowadays in England, the office of sheriff is still there, but it's pretty much kind of fallen into disuse. There's a weakening of the authority. It's much more ceremonial in nature. But think about this. When the colonists came over here and began to colonize America, they brought with them the common law of England, and they brought with them this office of sheriff. And in 1634, we have Captain William Stone being appointed as the first sheriff on American soil in Northamptonshire, Virginia. And then look at this, just a few years later in 1652. Folks, this is 120-something years before we declared our independence from Britain. What are we doing in America? We're electing our sheriffs. We are electing our government representatives because we understood the power and authority that was attached to that. The power comes from the people. Our founding documents are very clear, and then you then entrust and share and delegate that authority with these officials that you have elected. And then something really, really important happened in 1735 in the history of the office of sheriff. Sheriff John Nash was elected. Happens to be one of my ancestors. I did the family research on this, and I think he's my 8th or 9th great-grandfather on the Nash side was a sheriff. We also have some on the Rabin side. My Uncle Joe Rabin is in the audience, and we have some law enforcement officials there too. And then we've got a little bit of statistics here. There's over 3,000 sheriffs in America. Almost all of them are elected. There are some appointed sheriffs, believe it or not, but most all of them are elected, and by virtue of that are accountable back to you, the people. Now, as we began our western expansion, we of course took the office of sheriff with us into the Wild West, and you had some really colorful characters that were sheriffs during that era. You may not have known this. People like Wild Bill Hickok and Bat Masterson, and we mentioned Pat Garrett earlier. I came across this quote from a book called The American Sheriff. It said, not only did the sheriffs do regular things that you think of as sheriffs, but they did some unconventional types of punishment, including execution by choking. Can you imagine being the sheriff? You're out there fulfilling the order of the judge and choking the guy out into choking him to death. So anyway, I thought that was interesting. But the question is the agency properly called a sheriff's department, or is it properly called a sheriff's office? And why does it matter, and who really cares anyway? What do y'all think? I hear office is resounding out there, maybe the majority, and you're absolutely correct. Let me tell you why. This is a very important distinction. You'll see that sheriffs even disagree on this. We have sheriffs in South Carolina, for example. Some counties you have a sheriff's department, others you have a sheriff's office. So there's disagreement even among sheriffs. And as I get into this phase of my presentation, we're going to be getting into some areas that may be a bit controversial. And so stay tuned. I think this crowd can handle it. But this is an important distinction. So I went to Black's Law Dictionary to find out, because these are legal terms. And as Lauren said, it's very important for us to understand these terms as we are understanding these principles. So Black's Law Dictionary says that a department is a division of the executive branch of the government. It fulfills some type of administrative responsibility. So let's think about this for a minute. We're here in the city of Myrtle Beach, South Carolina. Myrtle Beach is a municipality under the laws of South Carolina. It's actually considered to be a political subdivision of the state. And because it is this government entity called the City of Myrtle Beach, within that government, we'll have departments. You'll have a police department. You'll have a fire department, a codes enforcement department, a planning department, a parks and recreation department. These are departments because they're divisions of this overall government that we call the City of Myrtle Beach. We see the same thing at the federal level, right? We have the Department of Energy, we have the Department of Defense, Department of the State, and so on. These are branches, or not branches is the incorrect word, it's a division of, in this case, the executive branch of the federal government. That's what a department is. It's like going to Walmart. All right, Walmart is a department store. So you have the men's department and the women's department and the sporting goods department and the houseware department and this department and that department, garden department, but it's all part of Walmart, right? These are divisions within inside. So an office is different in this respect. An office is a right and a correspondent duty to exercise a public trust. An office actually maintains a portion of the sovereign power of the state from a constitutional perspective. And this is very, very important for us to understand this. Because a sheriff fulfills an office, that office maintains part of that sovereign power that comes from you, the people. I mean, you know, we don't call it a governor's department or the president's department or the attorney general's department. These are offices, and each one has been entrusted with a portion of that sovereign power. For those of you from South Carolina, you know that we call our chief prosecutors of a judicial circuit, we call them what in South Carolina? Solicitors. Other states, it's a district attorney or a state's attorney. Another carryover from our common law heritage, we call them solicitors. So back home in the First Circuit, we have a solicitor, David Pascoe, is a good friend, and he often would call me up and say, well, how are things at the sheriff's department? And I would say, I don't know, how are things at the solicitor's department? And he'd say, okay, you got me. Because it's a solicitor's office, right? And so I think it's important, the terminology that we use here, because there's power attached to these words. And this distinction right here is what gives sheriffs, as well as any other elected executive, the power and authority to stand on constitutional issues. You see, I've been a police chief before. I was police chief for 2 different agencies. And a police chief is an employee. A police chief works for the mayor and the city council, and if they tell the chief to do something, he's obligated to go do it. Now, if they tell him to do something illegal or unethical, he certainly can stand and say, well, I'm not going to do that, but they can also fire us behind, can't they? You know, when I was police chief, we had this favorite saying that, you know, sheriffs have to run for their job every 4 years, but chiefs have to run every day. And there was a lot of chiefs can be fired at will. So you really don't have the power to make these stands, and it makes me think about what's going on in Kentucky with Kim Davis, the elected county clerk that's there that made a stand. And we're going to talk about her in a minute and the stand that she made, and you'll see how it ties back into this idea.